Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to afternoon session of the symposium. Can you hear me? The first presenter is Dr. Gerson Rodrigues. He's a professor and director of Ellen G. White Research Center in Northeast Brazil College. Probably he is deeply interested in the relationship between Ellen White and James White. So the title that he's going to present today is an example of industry and economy for others. The white couple spirit of sacrifice in the early Sabbatarian Adventist movement. Let's give warm welcome to Dr. Rodrigues. You have 45 minutes.
Okay, I'll talk about James and Ellen White and the spirit of sacrifice they had in the beginning of the Adventist movement. We all know that they were married in August 30, 1846, and after the great disappointment, their lives had a radical change because they were almost insignificant figures in the Millerite movement, and then they become the co-founders of the SDA Church. So I will select some experience the white couple faced and the sacrifice they made for the growth of the Sabbatarian Adventism during the first 10 years until 1855. I also will talk about something that they said they learned from those experiences, and then a brief word of caution from them on the subject. So it will be divided in the School of Rigid Economy, then what they learned and the result, and then a reflection and advice. So we start with the School of Rigid Economy. James White said in 1880, but thinking about the first years, we entered upon this work penniless, with few friends and broken in health. Congregations were small, and he says that rarely did anyone come to our meetings except Adventists, unless they were attracted by the curiosity of hearing a woman speaking. So they had no money, they had no places of good meeting to do good meetings. So it was not an easy beginning. In those early days, the whites prioritized giving everything they had to the growth of the infant cows, wearing poor clothing, and even suffering for lack of adequate food was a decision they made in order to have some means of investing in spreading the Sabbatarian Adventist message. So in 1847, they had their first son, Henry Nichols. During those days, they were living with some friends. In October 1847, they went to live in Connecticut. They used to live in Maine, in the Ellen's parents' house. And then in Maine, they commenced housekeeping with borrowed furniture. And then in 1848, we started the first sabbatical conference, Sabbatarian conference. At those days, James White said that when we have no special work to do in visiting the members, I feel it my duty to labor with my hands, so as not to be chargeable to others. And this was a privilege for him because he was living in others' house, but he would like to help them as well. No? And Ellen White also talking about this, she said, we had resolved not to be dependent, but to support ourselves and have things to help others. And we have some experience, for example, those days when Ellen White she could afford about only 1 pint of milk a day. And there was some time that she had to decide about being milk for 3 days or clothes for Henry. And said that one day she had to struggle between buying milk for 3 mornings or getting a piece of cloth for Henry. She decided to buy the cloth for an apron to cover her Henry's harms. All the time she said that she fainted off the floor with her child more than once. and she asked sometimes, has God abandoned us? In 1847, Henry got sick. He was 4 months old. And they prayed and prayed and prayed, but the boy was not getting better. And then they realized that they had made the child an excuse for not traveling and laboring for the good of others. And they feared the Lord was about to remove him. So they decided to say, Lord, we are going to keep traveling and doing everything you ask us to do. And when they promised to be faithful to their mission, Henry was healed, and they continued fulfilling their responsibilities. Those days, Ellen White, God showed her that those hard days was to prepare them to labor for others, not to set down in ease, and also to face greater conflicts that they would face in the years coming. In April 1848, they had the first conference in Connecticut, in Rock Hill. James was working the railroad, but he left that and he went to the field to cut some wood. He developed rheumatism in his wrists and couldn't sleep for several nights because of severe pain. And he said that he worked from early morning till dark to earn about 50 cents a day. Then came other meetings in New York, and again he was struggling. He had to work, and he was not feeling very well physically. But he says, I was destitute of means, and with feeble health, entered to the hay field to earn the sum necessary to bear our expenses to that meeting. I took a large job of mowing, and when fainting beneath the noonday sun, I would bow before God in my swath, call upon him for strength, rise refreshed, and mow on again. In 5 weeks, I earned enough to bear our expenses to the conferences. And then they got money so they could go to the conference in New York. But they had a new dilemma. When they went to Connecticut, they took Henry with them. But now as they had to go to New York, they couldn't have Henry with them. Henry was 10 months old, and they had to leave him with other family. And Ellen White said this was a severe trial to me. I had not been separated from him before for one night. My health was poor, and it was impossible for me to travel and have the care of our child. And we dared not let our affection for the child keep us from the path of duty. So it was not an easy way for them, but they had to decide that they had to leave Henry with other people. And then, just 2 months late, they had a new dilemma. They had to leave Henry. At that time, he was about 1 year old, in the care of others permanently. So they had to travel more and more, and Henry stayed in the other's house. And Ellen White also writing about this, she said, alone before the Lord with most painful feelings and many tears, I made the sacrifice and gave up my only then 1 year old for another, to exercise a mother's feeling toward him and to act a mother's part. His sad little face as I left him was before me night and day. Yet, in the strength of the Lord, I put him out of my mind and sought to do others good. And then Henry stayed in the brothers Howland's family for the next 5 years. And Ellen White writing in 1850, she said, and once she said, I have the privilege of being with my oldest boy 2 weeks. He's a lovely boy. He became so attached to his mother, it was hard to be separate from him. But as our time is all employed in writing and folding and wrapping papers, I am denied the privilege of having his company. My other little one, Edson, is many hundred miles from me. Sometimes Satan tempts me to complain and think my lot is a hard one. But I will not harbor this temptation. I want all self to die. She faced an experience that she didn't like much. She said that once One sister thought it must be very pleasant to be riding through the country without anything to trouble me. It means she was traveling without her boys. No? And she said it was just such a life as she should delight in. At that very time, my heart was yearning for my children, especially Edson. He was in New York, and I had just come from my sleeping room where I had been battling with my feelings and with many tears had besought the Lord for strength to subdue all murmuring and that I might cheerfully deny myself for Jesus' sake. And she basically summarized this saying, the greatest sacrifice I was called to make in connection with the work was to leave my children to the care of others. James Edson was born in 1849. At that time, they were preparing material for the present truth. And the present truth also has an interesting story. In 1848, November, Ellen White said, I have a message for you, James. You must begin to print a little paper and send it out to the people. At that time, the poverty, physical infirmities, lack of time, and probably a little lack of faith led them, especially James, more to discouragement than enthusiasm. And by April 1849, they went to live with the Belden family in Connecticut. And with no financial resources, Jamie became discouraged and he went to work again in the hayfield. And at that time, Ellen fainted and she said she had a vision. And in the vision, the Lord showed that he would not give James strength to labor in the field, for God had another work for him to do, and that if he ventured into the field, he would be cut down by sickness, but that he must write, and walk out by faith. So, under the circumstance most unfavorable, and without no means, overwhelmed with a sense of duty to take the field in defense of the truth, James immediately began the work of writing and publishing the present truth. He sat down and wrote every word of that first issue. When he came across with some difficult passage, he and Ellen would join in prayer together, pleading for an understanding of the true meaning of his words. So he was alone. He and Ellen White, he just had his Bible, Cruden Concordancy, and a Bible dictionary, and that's the way he wrote our first regular periodical, The Present Truth. And then the articles were ready, but they had no money. So James had to find a printer who would agree to print copies of the newspapers. He said that summer he had to write it, correct it, send the newspaper, and walk the distance of about 13 kilometers to the printer 2 or 3 times a week, made that summer as the hardest in terms of work. But they published the first number of The Present Truth, and they brought it home, and it was a time of great joy for them. They prayed about the periodical, and they started sending the periodical. But there was another problem, another dilemma. Bates was against this, because Bates was used to write some pamphlets, and for him, the pamphlets were more efficient than the periodical. So besides the lack of money and time and health, now James had to face Joseph Bates, that he was not in favor of this periodical. So the lack of encouragement led James to depression, and he worked, and he said, as for the poor little paper, it has so little sympathy, and I fear so few prayers, that I think it will die. I am in deep trial. I think I shall hang all up for the present. But then again, Ellen White had a vision. And in the vision, she wrote to both Bates and James White, and she said, press together, press together, press together, press together, 4 times. Yes, shepherds, lest the sheep be scattered. love one another, swim, 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 plunge deep, deep, deep in the ocean of God's love. So with the encouragement of his wife, and then after this vision, Bates thought about it, and he started writing also articles for the periodical, and he helped James White also with the periodical, and so James continued on. They also lived in very different places. In 1849, they were living in Connecticut, and then in 1850 in New York, then in late 1850 and 51 in Paris, Maine. Then they went back to New York. Then they, in 1852, they moved to Rochester, and there they stayed for about 3 years. And then they moved to Battle Creek, Michigan. The 1850s were not an easy decade for the whites. In 1851, rumors began to spread that James had not demonstrated integrity in his finances. Accusations were spreading among some members, and then James, completely discouraged, he decided to stop publishing the paper. But with the help of his wife, he managed to continue. So it was not easy for him to continue, but his wife was behind him, say, well, God showed me that we should continue this. So he gave this sacrifice of being writing and publishing this periodical. Then in 1852, they moved to Rochester, and there they rented a house for $175 a year. In this house lived the White family, James' wife, Ellen, Henry, and Edson. It was good for them because they could have the boys with them. And Willie was born in 1854. Besides that, they had 2 domestic helpers, and also the publishing staff were living with them. So Ellen White calculated that at those days about 15 to 20 people lived in the same house. She says economy was important and necessary at the time, but it was definitely challenging for all of them. We all know this passage here, this quotation. You would smile, could you look it upon us and see our furniture? We have bought 2 old bedsteads for 25 cents each. My husband brought me home 6 old chairs, no 2 of them alike, for which he paid $1, and soon he presented me with 4 more old chairs without seating, for which he paid 62 cents. The frames are strong, and I have been sitting them with drilling. Butter is so high that we do not purchase it. Neither can we afford potatoes. We use sauce in the place of butter and turnips for potatoes. And then she continues on saying that it was not easy for them. So, but she says the Lord's hand was in our coming to this place, because Rochester was in a nice city, and it was a city that they could have the headquarters there in a better place than other places in the United States. The time they first, then in 1852, they bought their first press, $650. Hiram Edson helped them with this. And then I'm not going to read this. John Loughborough talks about the way they published their first booklets with their own press. John Andrews, The Sanctuary in the 2300 Days. And he talks about the hard work to do this. But then he says, we were a happy company together, for you were getting off the first book printed on a press owned by Seventh-day Adventists. At the same time, during the 1850s in Rochester, Ellen White received the news that her brother, Robert Harmon, died in 1853. And Nathaniel White and Anna White was living, they were living with James and Ellen in Rochester. And they both died also. And James' health was deeply affected, and he almost died because of that as well. During the same time, the Message Truth, a dissident group, started publishing periodical against the Adventists, it was also a difficult time for them to face this dissident group as well. And then Ellen White wrote his anxiety of mind, talking about James, the burdens which he bore in Rochester, his labor in the office, sickness and deaths in the family, the lack of sympathy from those who should have shared his labor, together with his traveling and preaching were too much for his strength. And he seemed to be fast going down to a to a grave. There was a time of gloom and darkness. It seemed at times that God had forsaken us. James White wrote in 1855, in February 1855, and he said, well, the effort and dedication of those involved in the publishing house was good. They basically work for no more than food and clothing, so they face a lot of scarcity and difficulties. And then he opened his heart. James White said, without capital and without health, we cannot much longer bear the burden. And this burden meant to care for a large family, publications, travel, and church work. He said, I'm working 14 to 18 hours a day. He was facing illness and deaths in his family, brought him very close to the grave. And he said, well, I have to move. I have to change my lifestyle. He said that he would dedicate rest from care and outdoor exercise. I don't know if he did this because he kept working and working and working, but he had in mind, well, I have to do something different. He knew what to do, but I don't know if he kept his promise. And then also to be free from the care of a large family. So they rented another house, and the publishing house was with another place, and he could live with his family in their house in Rochester. And then in 1855, they moved to Barrow Creek. And Ellen White described as from the time we moved to Barrow Creek, the Lord began to turn our captivity. We found sympathizing friends in Michigan who were ready to share our burdens and supply our wants. It was not an easy time also in Barrow Creek. James White, you get sick in 1865. In 1860, they lost their youngest son, Herbert. In 1863, they also lost Henry. So they didn't have an easy time in Barrow Creek. But the purpose of this paper is to talk about those first years up to 1855. And I think they were more difficult than the rest of their lives when we think about money and other things. Now, what the couple learned and the results, James White wrote, industry and economy have been our strength in laboring to build up the cause in the days of our poverty and the poverty of the cause. So he continues to say here in another article, we learned the value of money. It was as if God had a design in choosing us to our poverty and humility to not only have a care for the temporal interests of the cause, as well as the spiritual, but to make us an example of industry and economy for others. Several times the whites deprived themselves even the necessary of life to save money for the cause of God and accomplish as much as they could. And also they learned to help each other, both James and Ellen, to encourage one another in those difficult days. And then White also said that God was preparing them to labor for others, not to settle down in ease, and for the still greater conflicts. We had this slide before, so it's here again just to make the point here. Ellen White says what they had to learn in those hard days. And then it made them a generous couple. The Whites came out of near penniless at the time of their marriage during the 1940s and 50s with many financial difficulties. But in later years, they managed to live in a more comfortable middle-class status. And Ellen White said that God blessed them and they gave them prosperity and live in abundance. They had hard times in the beginning, but then they were much more comfortable regarding financial matters. Ellen White defined her husband as a hard-working, honest man who would make any and every sacrifice for the truth's sake, who the widow and the fatherless have ever found in him a friend. This is interesting. And even washwomen of the world, that's the language she used, he would pay more than their usual prices. So he had a good heart. If someone worked for him, doing some work in his home, according to Ellen White, he used to pay even more than the usual price other people that. So he seems to have a good heart. James also asked for donations for the cause of God and to encourage the liberality of his brothers. He himself began with liberal donations. And we see in the Review and Herald several times when James and Ellen, they gave money to support the cause and also support other people as well. The encyclopedia says that the White's name is found at the head of innumerable fundraising, whether it be $10 to help relieve a church member who needed relief, or $50 to assist a fellow minister get a house, or $2,000 to help build Battle Creek College. So they were very in front of this giving money. James White taught that from about 1873 to 1878, they put $15,000 in the several branches of the cause. Ellen White also says that she could build costly houses if she wanted, but she didn't do this because she put the money in the cause. And she says that she didn't regret a penny that they had invested in the cause, which amounted about $30,000. She wrote this by the end of the 1880s. So they had given $30,000 for the cause. Ellen White also donated the royalties from some of her books. We have, for example, Ministry of Healing, to reduce the debt of some Adventist medical institutions. Then the Christ's Object Lessons to help Adventist education. And then to conclude, some wise advice from the Whites, as they reflected about their lives in the beginning, the sacrifice. They had some word or even some regret, and I will spend a few minutes working on that. Ellen White said, when we lived there in Rochester, we did not eat nourishing food as we should, and disease nearly carried us to the grave. The motive we had was pure. It was to save means that the paper might be sustained. We were poor. If those who had means had done their part, the burden upon us would have been lightened. But as some did not do their part, we were burdened, and others eased. And then she says, I saw that God does not require anyone to take a curse of such rigid economy as to weaken or injure the temple of God. So she looked back and said, well, we did a lot of sacrifice and we had other people that could help us, but they didn't. Some of them didn't. So we had to work more and we had to put more money also. And then she said, God does not require that anyone go too far in a way that injure our body, the temple of God. So because then we get sick and we can't work as God wanted us to do. So she had a word of caution here about this. James White also, he said, we have toiled on in the cause of God for more than 20 years unselfishly. He wrote this in 1870. And have carried out the most rigid industry and economy, have suffered excessive weariness, cold and hunger, to save means to the cause. I have given of our scant purse, when we should have used the means for our own necessities, And then he says, we now regret that we have robbed ourselves and family to help others, and have robbed the cause of God of more efficient service by wearing out too soon in the exercise of too rigid industry and economy. And he was facing some strokes by that time, but he has in mind the first years when he did more than he could, as he's saying that the School of Industry and Economy was too hard. And some of things that he did, he recognized that it robbed him for a better service for the Lord. Industry, James White again. Industry and economy have been our strength in labor to build up the cause in the days of our poverty and the poverty of the cause. We recommend a return as far as and as fast as consistent to the industry and economy which God greatly blessed in the beginning of our work. So now he say, well, this new generation, so the second Adventist generation, he says, I would like to see you guys also doing more sacrifice. But then he continued, we are under the strong conviction that we have too long labored beyond our strength, and that in taking more responsibilities than we could well bear, we have from necessity done many things imperfectly. We have greatly erred in trying to do too much. So he says the new generation should have the same love for the cause and also do some sacrifice in a balanced way. And he also says that he worked so much, he did it so much that sometimes he made mistakes because he had a lot of responsibilities, and that was not good according to him. So when James was recovering for his first stroke, Ellen White brought James a chair so that he could spend some time sitting in a more comfortable chair and not spend all his time lying down. This is an interesting experience. And she was thinking about paying $15 for a chair. But the guy in the store said that they had a very excellent chair with rollers instead of rockers. And it cost $30, but it was for $17. So $2 more than she was thinking about spending in this chair. And there was someone beside her. And that person said, well, Sister White, I think it's better if you buy the cheaper chair because, you know, people will say that you are spending a lot of money and this and that. So she, based on that counsel, she decided to buy a cheaper chair. And the interesting thing is that to buy the cheaper chair did not prevent rumors about the extravagance in purchase that chair. So Ellen White, looking back at that experience, he said, well, had I the same to do over again, I would do as I did, with this exception. I would rely upon my own judgment and purchase a chair costing a few dollars more and worth double the one I got. So she said, well, even if you had to pay more, a little bit more, but the quality is better, she says, I would do that instead of being worried about what others would say about it. To John Andrews, she said he was in Europe, then he came to Battle Creek, and he was anxious to go back to Europe to work, and she said, anxiety and care have been your portion for some length of time. Your nervous system must have time to rally, and you must not become too anxious to resume your labors. Should you spend some weeks at our sanatorium, it would be a benefit to you if you would rest and not be uneasy and feel condemnation if you are not in actual service. You must care for the body. So this is fantastic. She's saying to Andrews, and he had just lost his daughter as well. And she said, well, you should stay a little bit more in the sanatorium, resting. And she says, do it. And do not feel condemnation if you are not in actual service. So in his mind, he had to be working. She said, no, rest a while and do not condemn yourself because of that. You need this to recover your health. You need to care for your body. Writing for the church in general in 1893, she had just lost her husband 12 years ago, and he also died because of excess of working and anxiety and all of these things. And now she says, day follows day, and each day brings its responsibilities and duties. But the work of tomorrow must not be crowded into today. The work of tomorrow must not be crowded into today. The workers in the cause of God should feel how sacred is its character, and they should prepare themselves for tomorrow's work by a judicious employment of their powers today. So let us do what you have to do today. The work for tomorrow, we live for tomorrow. And if you have a nice rest, we have more energy for do the work in the next day. So, in conclusion, James and Ellen understood that their experience of deprivation and scarcity at the beginning of the Sabbatarian movement served as a school to prepare them to face difficult times later on, to learn to live with little and save to help others. Although the white couple were called to a type of ministry that not everyone is called to, their dedication and purpose in the growth of the Adventist movement has been an example to us. Although James and Ellen sacrificed a lot for the cause and were happy for the help they had given to the church, they also regretted some of the extreme sacrifice they made and left a brief and balanced word of warning, because they knew that they suffered and that sometimes prostrated them in sickness, and especially for James White. And White also suffered for that, but James White with his strokes and other things, the illness, so he paid for his excess and not taking care properly of his body and also his mind. So my last slide says, the Adventist Church has much to learn from the way James and Ellen acted in love for the cause, which included a deep love for Jesus, a deep love for Sabbath-keeping friends, and a deep love for people to be saved. The church is also indebted to their hard work, which helped greatly in the growth of the church. We are grateful that, although James and Ellen sometimes went to extreme sacrifice, they recorded a warning not to overdo it and to live a balanced life that includes sacrifice, hard work, dedication, but in a moderate and balanced way, so that we can serve better and probably for longer. So may God help us to work in this way. Also, if we have means to help the cause of God, so others do not need to work more than they can, and also financially we can do our part, because they suffered because of that as well. Some people that could help them more, they didn't. But this is my word, my paper. Let us work, but in a moderate and in a balanced way. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation and paper. If you have questions, just post your questions in the Q&A section, and we will have a panel discussion, which will run from 4 to 5 p.m. Okay, Dr. Doc Matesio will respond to this presentation. He served as a pastor, overseas missionary, especially Japan, Indonesia, and Korea. And he worked as a professor at Burman University in Canada. He's now retired and living in Rio Vista, California. Dr. Matesio, you have 10 minutes to respond. Thank you.
From my experience, this paper is going to be very, very helpful. We needed this work. We needed to see many of these details of the experiences that the whites went through. When I was teaching SDA history at Burman University in Canada, quite often my students question the whites' practice of leaving their kids with others while traveling. They wanted to know, was that really the right thing to do? This came up almost every year when I was teaching Seventh-day Adventist history. When we went overseas, we did not make the same sacrifices that James and Ellen White did. But there was a sacrifice. We sold our house, and it was 20 years before we were able to buy a house again. So now in retirement, we still have a mortgage payment every month. Many of our neighbors here do not have to make that payment. They own their house. But this was a sacrifice we made when we took the call to go to the mission field. I found the narrative details to be compelling. The paper kept my attention. This is something that we definitely need to be aware of. Many people, many Adventists are probably not aware of these details. I did not know, for example, that baby Henry's healing was linked to the whites' willingness to travel and encourage the believers. This shows that God was superintending some of these things that we look at and we see as extreme sacrifices, that God was in some of these sacrifices that they made. God helped them with financial needs over and over again. James was given the strength to mow the hay. Henry lived with the Howland family for 5 years. Who of us would allow a 1-year-old child to be to live with another family for 5 years? But his mother at the time, she wrote, "God is pleased with my sacrifice, that of offering up my children to him." This paper provides many details illustrating hard work and poverty. It mainly presents a positive view of these sacrifices. James wrote, "God had a design in choosing us in our poverty and humility to make us an example of industry and economy for others." Then, bam, we come to the concluding bombshell. Gerson writes, although they were happy for the help they had given to the church, they also regretted some of the extreme sacrifices they had made. Page 27. Let's look at 4 kinds of sacrifices that they made. The first 2 are industry and economy. The third one is nutrition. And the fourth one is separation from their children. In 1870, James wrote, "We now regret that we have robbed ourselves and family to help others." And Ellen also wished that she had purchased the more expensive chair. Even Ellen White, the prophetess of God, had regrets over her behavior. They both admitted that they took overworking and penny pinching to extremes. The third one is nutrition. This statement has just been read a few minutes ago. I saw that God does not require anyone to take a course of such rigid economy as to weaken or injure the temple of God. And the fourth one is separation from their children. I looked for statements of regret, but I found none in this paper. Now, there may be some statements of regret somewhere out there in the letters and the writings, but I found none in this paper. Why are there no statements of regret about having to leave their children with others? After 5 years with the Howland family, Henry returned to his parents, quote, a well-trained praying boy, unquote. Perhaps he got better nutrition and more direct care with the Howlands than he would have gotten with his own parents. If the whites are an example of industry and economy for others, how are we supposed to follow the example of people who came to regret what they did? This is the question, the burning question of this paper. How can we be inspired by the whites without necessarily copying everything they did? The paper emphasizes following the example of the whites, but leaves it mainly up to the individual reader to figure out how to do that. Where do you draw the line between sacrifice and extremism? Perhaps a little scriptural integration would be helpful. I'm going to just make 2 points from the Bible here. The first one is that followers of Jesus walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Romans 8, verse 4. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. Also see Galatians, that's Romans 8:14. Also see Galatians 5:18. The Spirit prompts us as to where to draw the line between sacrifice and extremism. And the second point I want to make is the paper remembers the contribution of these 2 leaders in the Advent movement. Hebrews 13, verses 7 and 8. For me, this is the key text that helps us to understand how we can follow the example of the whites. Hebrews 13, verses 7 and 8, New International Version. Remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. There are 3 verbs here: remember, consider, and imitate. Remember is an imperative. That's a command. We are commanded to remember our leaders. This is exactly what Gerson has done here. He has remembered James and Ellen White. But it's not just remembering their names, but we are asked to consider the outcome of their way of life. This is not an imperative verb. This is not the imperative mood. This is a present participle. When we remember, we are asked to be considering or noticing or observing And it includes both the good and the bad, which is the strength of this paper, that the good and the bad are both mentioned. Too often we don't do that. We could have been considering their habits of working hard and spending wisely, but also noticing their tendency to overwork and economize extremely. And the third verb is imitate. That's an imperative. That's a command. We are commanded in the Bible to imitate our leaders. But notice what it says. Imitate their faith. Doesn't say copy their workaholic tendencies or their doubting or their discouragement or everything they ever did. Imitate their faith, their willingness to trust God with its resulting good works. Other passages in the scripture could also contribute to an understanding of how to follow through on this paper. 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 to 13, 2 Thessalonians 3, verses 6 to 12, 1 Peter 2, verse 21. Finally, in remembering our leaders, we should never forget who made their exploits possible. Verse 8 of chapter 13 in Hebrews. Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. When we imitate the faith of James and Ellen, we are imitating Christ who lived within them.
Thank you for the response. Dr. Rodrigues, you have also 5 minutes to answer to his response.
I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Matasio, for his words. It was very precise and important. Your suggestions are great, and we will strengthen this paper much more, especially if this biblical. I didn't use that, but as the way you brought there was very, very important, and I like that. So thank you very much for your words and for your suggestions. And you said that the paper does not show how to imitate them, and that's true. I think that we need the Holy Spirit work in us, saying, well, do that. This you are going too far, and it's hard to have a line for everyone in every place. As you said, you did some sacrifices in the missionary field. That's true. We all do sacrifice, and we have to do sacrifice. This is important. That's I put also the James and Ellen as kind of an example for us in some things, not in everything, as you showed it very well here in your comments. So may God help us to be moderate and at the same time do the best that we can for the cause of God. This is important. So once more, thank you very much, Dr. Matasio.